I have a huge backlog of videos that I have to get out there, but this is very time sensitive, so I want to get right into this story with my next guest, James Caspian. James, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself briefly, and then please tell everybody why it's so important that they hear your story and act on it right away.
Thank you, Oren. I worked for 10 years in the gender field, helping people with gender transition, talking to people who were thinking about it, wondering about it. And a couple of years ago, I realized there was a need to research people who reversed and regretted their gender reassignment because their numbers seemed to be rising. So I undertook an MA at Bath Spa University in order to do this research. In a nutshell, Bath Spa University vetoed the research, and I'd been studying for some time before we got to that point, refused to give me my fees back when I asked for them back. And the reason they gave for preventing my research was that it might attract criticism on social media, and criticism would be bad for the university. So I was astonished by this decision. This is suppression of free speech, and certainly in the opinion of my lawyers, it is in law. We are in a climate of growing suppression of free thinking and free speech, not just in academia, but in our public institutions as well as in society at large. And I realized that my case is at the matrix of this problem. I'm seeking to raise upwards of £50,000 in order to take the university to court. A court needs to decide whether or not that was a lawful decision, and we contend that it wasn't. So it's a very important case, not just for people in academia, but I believe for everybody in our society.
And the description has links to how anybody can contribute to your cause. And the deadline for the funds needed?
I need to apply to the High Court by the 8th of March. So I need by the end of February to know that I have the money behind me. Unfortunately, it's very expensive to bring a legal action, and also one needs to have funds to cover oneself in case of losing or in need of appeal, because the law is quite a complex creature. So I've been raising funds on crowd justice. I've managed to raise nearly £8,000 so far.
Right.
But I need to raise a lot more quickly.
And so, people talk about they want to help fight the cause, and many people feel powerless. What can they do? Can you retweet? Can you say something on Facebook? Well, here's a chance. If you can't do it directly, if you don't have the means, you can contribute to a cause like this. It's going to go directly to your justice fund, let's put it. And so I strongly encourage people. I'll be doing it myself. I encourage people to contribute what you can. If everyone chipped in a few dollars, this could be one of the most important, let's say, nails in the coffin of political correctness, stifling free speech, and in this case, research.
Yes, exactly. And I've discovered that many academics have had this problem, and students. The thing is that most people don't fight it because they want to get their degree or they want to stay at their university. So they do what the university wants. They change their proposals, they change their research. I wasn't willing to do that. I've stood up to the city at some considerable cost to myself, not just financially, but emotionally and psychologically as well. And so it's a big fight. And I think you put it very well. It's a chance to put a nail in the coffin of political correctness and in law, because as one commentator has noted, the only way that universities can be made to change the culture that they've been developing is in court. It's through law. Not through what people are saying on Twitter or Facebook, but in court, in law. That's very important. And this is an opportunity to do that.
Right. And I want people to understand your position. What do you have to gain from putting your name, your reputation, your money, your future on the line?
Personally, I have very little to gain. I found myself in the eye of a storm, and I'm willing to go through that. I'm willing to take the action necessary on behalf of all of us. Because I went to a very good workshop recently where we were asked, what do you serve? What or whom do you serve? It was put to us that everybody serves someone or something. And I thought about this seriously, and I thought, actually, I serve truth. And
right.
So that's why this is important.
Yeah, I always write truth with a capital T. And when I heard you say truth, I visualized a capital T. That's very important, right? And there's a lot of talk about this. People are saying this. And again, I think it's so important. I really hope that people are going to watch this, spread this video, and contribute to your fund, because you don't have tenure. You don't have a great, cushy Patreon account covering your daily living. This is a huge personal risk that you're taking for the sake of truth.
Yes.
And if you can, maybe we'll backtrack a little bit now. If you can elaborate on the work that you have been doing so that people understand why you're doing what you're doing, where you're coming from, and that you're not simply a transphobic monster.
I worked for 10 years in a private gender clinic in the UK where people would come because they were considering medical transition, or they were considering their options, or they were simply wondering what to do with how they felt. And I was a counsellor there. And so I worked over 10 years with hundreds of people, many of whom did decide to go on to medical transition. I'm also the trustee of a charity, the Beaumont Trust, which is a charity that supports and educates about transgendered people and people who cross-dress and anybody on that spectrum. And I don't feel that this controversy is really about any particular person's transition. I've been very supportive of trans people in my work. And in fact, I've been around trans people since I was about 16 years old. And so it's the political side of this which is the controversy, not about any individual person's transition. That's their personal affair. But it's also about psychological and medical ethics, because we're seeing something happen that was not happening before, with the vast numbers, greater numbers of young people that are identifying under the trans umbrella, and some of whom are having medical treatments, serious medical treatments and surgeries that they are then coming to regret. And they are being quite vocal about that and about why they think that happened. We have an ethical duty to research into this phenomenon and to be able to discuss it and speak about it openly.
Exactly, and that's why I have been making these videos, because as a psychologist, we have to be guided by best practices. And what I was hearing from many people was that that was not being followed, that it was being ideologically driven, not scientifically or even ethically driven. So I want to ask you, when you say that, a couple of questions. First, with, let's say, the transition process, where you see people doing it, there's a lot of controversy over what age these things are happening. And people say that's not true, there's guidelines. So in your practice, let's start with the binding of breasts, for example. At what age were you seeing that? And then talk about, please, the puberty blockers or hormone blockers, and then cross-sex hormones, and then surgery. What have you seen in your experience as far as the ages?
Well, first of all, I have to tell you, I have never worked with children. So in the earlier years, I did work with adolescents of 16 upwards, and in latter years, the clinic only saw people over 21. Okay. So I was seeing, I would say, young women in their mid to late teens, most of whom were binding, and who would come wanting to have double mastectomy and or testosterone, and it could be in either order. I was also increasingly seeing women coming who had some kind of alternative gender identity. Genderqueer used to be quite popular, and that's now, I think, changed to non-binary. And I would ask people what they meant by non-binary, and people found it very difficult to really explain what it really meant. And it seemed that what they meant was they didn't feel they conformed to either gender role, male or female. They didn't really relate to either gender role. And I would say, well, this is actually then a question of gender roles. You know, the difference between gender identity and gender roles is very unclear, because, of course, lots of people don't conform, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to transition or that they should transition. So we're seeing more and more young women who had identified as lesbians, who are then identifying as an alternative gender identity, wanting to have double mastectomies without any other treatment. And there have been cases of people in that group who have then regretted it, and some of whom have then taken their doctor to court as well, because they regretted their treatment and they felt the doctor shouldn't have let them.
Where are they taking their doctors to court?
In the States, and and it's happened in the UK as well.
I've been talking about this as well. I've been tweeting about this because people ask me, when are things going to change? I say, well, when there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people suing their doctors or therapists, that's when it's going to change. So when you say that they're suing their doctors, is it the doctor that performed the procedure? Is it the gender-affirming therapist? Who gets caught up in this, in the lawsuits?
It would be the doctor who made the referral for the surgery.
Okay.
The doctor said, yes, I'll sign you off to go to the surgeon, because the surgeon will not be the person who will make that decision. Although, of course, the surgeon will have the final say. If they're not happy with the patient, they'll say no, I don't want to go ahead. But the surgeon will rely on the doctor, or in some cases the psychologist, to make an assessment and make the referral. So it's with that person that the buck stops. I was aware that some people did that. However, it was always sort of put in the transgender medical field that was a very small number of people, because the very few studies showed that it was maybe between 1 and 3 or 4%. But these studies are very small and they're quite old. However, I noticed a change in the patient group over the last few years, and increasingly younger people with many more mental health problems, and who didn't fit the kind of profiles that we'd seen in the past of the patients, because the median age of people transitioning at gender clinics used to be around 41, 42. And now we were seeing 3 times as many people in their late teens and girls, natal girls coming, natal females. And there was something happening, and there was no research into it. And then about 2.5 years ago, I was talking to Dr. Miro Djordjevic, who is a surgeon I know very well, who works in Serbia, in Belgrade, and he does a lot of gender reassignment surgeries, both ways, male to female and female to male. And he said that he had done several reverse surgeries at the request of people who'd regretted their initial surgery. He said, this hasn't happened before. This needs to be researched. This is very important. And I agreed with him. So that's when I decided to sign up and spend my own money at Bath Spa University in my spare time, because I'm a self-employed therapist and I worked very hard, many hours. And I decided to do this research. So that's how I got to the university, to put forward my proposal to do some qualitative research, which would have been in-depth interviews with a small number of people on their experiences of gender transition and reversing gender transition. The university initially passed the proposal. The proposal was actually to interview people who'd reversed surgery, which is, of course, quite rare, right, even though the numbers are growing. I later amended the proposal when I found it difficult to get people who were willing to talk, because people contacted me and said they felt so traumatized by what had happened to them that they didn't want to talk about it, which confirmed the need for the research. And so I was contacted by a group of young women in North America who'd reversed their gender transitions without reversing any surgery. In their case, their surgery tended to be double mastectomy. So they weren't having implants, which would have been reversal, so they didn't qualify for my study. So I went back to the university and said, I want to include these people, and I also want to widen my net for attracting respondents. And that was when the university came back and said, no, you can't do it. And they were very clear. They said because it might attract criticism on social media, that would be bad for the university. And furthermore, it is better not to offend people, they said. So that was when I went to a lawyer who said he believed that contravened the Human Rights Act and the Education Act. So I knew immediately that I was caught up in something huge, because I've known for years that we were moving into a climate where it was not all right to talk about certain topics to people, that if you offended somebody in some way, you could be attacked. And I do think mass use of social media has accelerated that tendency hugely. When I was younger, if you were studying something and you wanted to discuss a differing point of view with someone, it was fine. You were entitled to have a differing point of view. It was considered to be stimulating. It was grist for the mill. It was how people developed their thinking and their ideas. And I was aware, as I think most of us are, that we've moved into a sphere where people are afraid to say what they think because it might offend someone, and it might, worse than that, break some kind of policy or law, which could result in them being disciplined, dismissed, or even taken to court. So we have this whole politically correct scenario, which is being solidified by policy and law, and that's something new. But when I was at university first, although I went quite late, I was in my early 40s and I studied Mandarin. And I lived in China for a year, and I did make a study of the Cultural Revolution. And I do see similarities between what's been happening in our society and the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which was, of course, very bloody. ours is a bloodless attempt at a cultural revolution by, I think, some people that want to break down the established order. But also I'm aware that the patterns are similar, that where there's a kind of a group think, people call it, where if you don't conform to that particular way of thinking, that you will be a kind of an outcast, and people are afraid. And I was hearing this from some of the people that had contacted me about their reverse gender transitions. And I was doing preliminary research for nearly 2 years before it got to the point where the university said I couldn't carry out the project. And in that 2 years, I was constantly uncovering more and more, particularly young women who were regretting transition. I was reading what they were saying, that many of them felt they'd been kind of caught up in something. It was kind of a bit of a movement amongst particularly young lesbians, it seemed, to move into the whole idea of being trans. And the whole idea of being trans, which as an umbrella term has become huge and vast and can, I think, it almost cover everybody in a way. People talk about non-binary, and actually I think there's a very good argument that everybody is non-binary. Everybody. And indeed, Carl Jung said that all males had an anima and all women had an animus. That is a contrasexual component. And that was perfectly normal. And furthermore, the degree to which they had that, or expressed that, would change throughout life. It would move around. It was kind of fluid, if you like, not the word that he used. So there's nothing really new in that. However, what is new is the kind of politicization and polarization that has become part of that whole conversation, where some people are in and some people are out, and you're not allowed to say certain things. So I and my colleagues knew very well. I think, we instinctively pick up that there are certain things that we shouldn't talk about in public, and we knew that we were seeing a big change in what was happening in people presenting at gender clinics, and all the clinics have seen that, but they keep very quiet about it because people don't want to come under attack, and especially if they may be employed by somebody else and they may come under policies and so on, it's dangerous for them. So I'm in the unique position that I'm not actually beholden to anybody. I'm self-employed. I'm now semi-retired, and I have other interests than the gender field in which I work. But as I said to you earlier, I realized I was in the eye of a potential storm, and it certainly did turn into a storm, because when the media found out about what Bath Spa University had done, the coverage was vast, and it's out there to be seen and to be read. So I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the whole issue has brought together some of the most important strands of the day in Western democracies, which is the issue of the right to think and to speak and to discuss and to debate and to differ and to take a different point of view from the current trend, to be a maverick. And when I was in a very remote part of England last year, and I went into a shop to buy some gloves because it was very cold and I'd left my gloves at home. And I asked the assistant in this place for some gloves, and she said, I'll go and get some. And she brought out a whole tray full of various gloves and said, now here are some men's gloves. Oh, those are the ladies' gloves. Oh, I'm not meant to say that, am I? And I thought, well, if a woman in a very rural backwater, in some ways, the part of England that it was, which is completely a sort of homogenous, non-diverse country area, has picked that up, that's part of her psyche, then everybody's got this. And so that really hit me, just how huge it is that when people internalize that message, that there are certain things, not just that I shouldn't say, I shouldn't even think. And of course, the suppression doesn't make any of it go away. It will only come out somewhere else in a more virulent form, which of course is a Jungian idea, that if you what you suppress and you put into the unconscious and into the shadow will only emerge elsewhere, but it'll be nastier. Right. So if we suppress any kind of controversial or negative, or in many cases they're not even controversial or negative thoughts. I mean, that woman's thought was perfectly rational and normal. Some of the clubs were much larger than the others.
Right, and I want to add something to that. When you talk about suppression, and when you suppress or repress material, not only does it come out, as you say, in a stronger form, but it's not under your control. That's the scary thing. When people are not able to discuss these things or to even think these things, they're still there. They don't go away, but we lose the control over it. We lose the ability to analyze, to integrate, to maybe dissect and say, okay, this part I agree with, this I don't. People are just blindly going into one track or another. And as you said, it's this polarization. It's creating these dichotomies. It's identity politics at its worst. And the sad thing is, those with the loudest voices, even if they're a tiny, proportion of the population in this kind of culture, they seem to have the greatest power at this point, and that is a real powerful deterrent to stop people from speaking out or for thinking or saying the wrong things, quote unquote wrong things.
I have started a Free Speech Matters Facebook page, and I've recently looked at Twitter. I believe it's Twitter where most of the kind of abuse happens to people, isn't it? I must admit, my attitude towards abuse is to just ignore it and just let it kind of go over my head. I wouldn't engage with it. I think that this kind of anonymous social media abuse is kind of like a conduit for people who can sit in their bedroom or wherever it is and just be absolutely vile. I mean, if you like, it's a place for them to sort of tip their shadow material into, isn't it? Right. So I don't need to engage with other people's shadow material.
Right, but you're not engaging yet. Interesting. Maybe it's because you are self-employed and you're not beholden to anybody that it doesn't matter if you engage or not. Once they've got their pitchforks out, they're coming after you. I mean, I had somebody, a comedian, tag my university trying to get me fired because I said I didn't think she was as funny as a few other comedians. She happened to be a woman, they were male, and she used the hashtag #MeToo, and hoping that this would be sufficient to get me fired from my university. So even if someone doesn't engage, they are still vulnerable to having their livelihoods, their reputations, their lives ruined.
Absolutely. And I think because I am in the position I'm in, that I'm uniquely placed to be able to do what I'm doing.
That's the thing. Most people, because of the risk, because of the threat to their livelihood, don't want to speak out, which is why I wanted to have you on. I want people to hear your story, and I want people to contribute to your fight so that, you can be on the vanguard. You are on the vanguard of this fight against lack of reason, lack of tolerance.
So. And I want to be very clear about why it's so important that we take this university to court. Because if we don't, then there's a message going out there covertly to these institutions that they can virtually be a law unto themselves.
Right.
And do if nobody does anything about this. And I do believe that the decision that was taken in the university was taken by people that probably had not very much experience, who somehow really believed they were doing the right thing, who were not aware in any way of the magnitude of the decision they were making or the implications of it on a wider scale. I really don't think that they could see that. Perhaps they can see it now. I don't know. But this is an opportunity to have a legal precedent created, to put before a judge. And I do think the judiciary is the most impartial section of our society. I think it is the least polluted by political correctness, I hope. And so if we can have a court and have a judge decide whether or not this decision was lawful, whether or not it was reasonable for the university to say, I can't do the research because they were worried about being criticized on social media, I think that this is an absolutely priceless opportunity, and that's why I'm asking people to give money. And I do need a lot of money. I need upwards of £50,000 to take this case forward, and I need it by the end of February. So I am appealing to people to really take this seriously. You can also read up on detail on the Crowd Justice website, on Freedom of Speech and Universities page. You can read up in the media. If you Google James Caspian, Bath Spa University, you will see the mass media coverage that's there.
So when these people that you spoke with were saying that they regret the whole process, and we know they're suing the referring doctor, have they said anything about the role that their family played in this whole process?
The impression I've got is that people would have quite a mixture of family reactions, ranging from being very supportive to being very unsupportive and everything in the middle, actually. So I'd say it's a complete spectrum of family reactions.
Okay. Because one thing that I'm being accused of, they're saying that I'm only taking the parents' side, and they're saying that all parents who don't naturally and automatically accept their children's proclamation, that suddenly, after 14, 15 years of never showing any signs of any gender confusion or dysphoria, suddenly saying, I am a boy or a girl, the opposite sex of their natal sex, that for a parent to be taken aback and to question and to wonder, is something else going on? They are being hateful, transphobic people. And so some people are arguing that I am giving a voice only to those people and not to the trans kids, who we have to accept right away, rather than saying, as you're explaining, and I think it's so clear, people need to hear this, that it's not just saying, what label do you want to use? Do you want to call yourself gender queer or non-binary gender or lesbian or anything like that? It's not about just that. It's about the consequences that come with that, which, again, opposite sex hormones, suppression, and, as you're saying, surgeries, mutilations, essentially, that could be completely unnecessary in many of these cases. So I appreciate whenever someone comes on who's had experience working with the real people and seeing the real consequences. This is not some abstract concept. It's a real phenomenon, and it's hurting many people. And it has nothing to do with hate. It has to do with concern about what these young people are hearing and are going through. So thank you for sharing this.
Yes, I agree with what people have said to you, that we need to talk to the people themselves, because my angle has always been that we need to do research. I have not really proffered opinions about what's been happening so much as offered observations. So I've always been very open to what people say, whatever it is. And I was simply observing that something was emerging on a large scale that we haven't seen before, and there's absolutely no research into it. At least there wasn't. There are now a couple of fledgling research projects coming out of the States into detransitioners. I was shocked when I discovered what was happening. I didn't know that until I started to research it. The more I looked and the more I found out what was going on, the more I realized we need to know. We need to hear from people. I have detransitioners contacting me on quite a regular basis now. And they're not unreasonable people. They're not transphobic people. I don't believe that one is transphobic for listening to them and wanting to give them a voice. Right. We need to hear from them. And I think that there's nothing to fear from talking to people who've regretted transition or are critical about it. What is there to fear? We want to find out the truth. And the truth, of course, is going to be very checkered. Of course, there are going to be people who transition and feel that that was the best thing that they could do, and they're glad they did it. And then there are going to be people who don't. So we need to know the full spectrum. Dr. Miro Djordjevic, the surgeon in Serbia, he does a lot of gender reassignment surgery, as I said, and he wants to know about what's happening out there because he's worried about his patients and his professional ethics. He's in no way transphobic. If he was, he wouldn't be doing dozens of gender reassignment surgeries every year.
And that's the thing. The research is essential, and that's why it brings us back to you. I mean, this is the ultimate form of deplatforming. And it's not even speaking about, that's the thing, is you're not speaking about anything. You're trying, as you say, to observe, to find out what's really going on. How can we have any opinions? How can we make any decisions or policies if we don't even know what's in the best interest of the people that we're supposedly serving?
Absolutely. And my research, as I said, was qualitative. It was actually called phenomenological analysis. It's a bit of a mouthful. What it means is you essentially let the people speak for themselves. The researcher kind of stays out of the way. I'm not in there with opinions and trying to manipulate anything. Of course, I simply wanted to give the people a platform to be heard.
Right, and that's it. It's qualitative. So you're not just giving them a survey with your own contrived questions and items. No. You're just saying, speak for yourself. Here's the opportunity to have your voice heard. And that has got shut down. So again, I hate to hammer the point home too much, but I think people really need to understand the implications of this. This goes well beyond you or me or any one voice. And again, it even goes beyond the trans issues, because it's about freedom of speech and the ability to think critically and to have these dialogues, as you're saying. And the way you framed it previously, I mean, that's what university used to be about. It was about having differing, dissenting opinions, learning from people who disagree with you, whereas today it's here's one silo, here's another silo, or echo chamber, and people will just go into them and do not want to hear anything from anyone else. And so that's why, again, that's the purpose of these videos, is to let these voices be heard. Now, in an article that you wrote, which is linked in the descriptions as well, you referenced somebody else who had, I believe, been deplatformed around the same time. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I think you mean Dr. Heather Brunskill-Evans, who's a fellow of King's College in London. Right. And I think she's a philosopher, she's a thinker. She likes to try to understand why things are happening and what's underneath them. And she appeared on a Radio 4 program with me called The Moral Maze. The Moral Maze takes a topical subject of the day and has 4 speakers speak for a few minutes, and a platform of 4 people who have been chosen by the radio then discuss it and comment on it and kind of come to a decision on it. And this particular Moral Maze program was about young people and gender transition. And Heather Brunskill-Evans, Dr. Brunskill-Evans, was on the program, and she expressed concern at young people and children, particularly prepubertal children, moving into gender transition too quickly. And the following week, she was prevented from giving a lecture she'd been engaged to give to some medical students at a university in London because of what she'd said on the program. And she was told that the students had felt that they wouldn't be safe around her because of her opinions. She had expressed really quite mild concern. That I think the program is out there if people wish to listen to it. I think it's on my YouTube channel, the James Caspian YouTube channel. That's
so ridiculous. One other thing, I think it was around August. To me, it all seemed around the same time, but my timing is not great at these days, where somebody in the States, I believe it was in August, and she was supposed to give a talk on detransitioners as well. They accepted her. It was a huge trans symposium, and she was accepted. And then at the last minute, after all the tickets had been purchased, et cetera, they were deplatformed. The organizers thought it might make a few people hurt, offended, unsafe. And I thought, well, then what about all the many people who are questioning whether they've made the right decision? What about the detransitioners? What about the many people who are not trans but are being told that they are, or being made to feel that they are? Do they not count then? Are their voices less important? This is why it's so important to have these discussions, because they are not in the micro minority. We don't know what percentage are detransitioners or desisters. We don't know yet, and that's why your research is so important. Let's find out.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, this is this new thought, which is words can be violent, or you're not safe if you're around certain opinions. This is ridiculous. And I've said this numerous times in media interviews, that we are teaching young people especially to be fragile, to be vulnerable, to be always on guard, tense, hyper-vigilant of the dangers all around them, versus being taught, you have a mind, you can think critically, hearing someone's opinions is not going to hurt you. It might make you a little bit upset, it might shock you, it might confuse you, but you have the ability to withstand that and to be able to process it. And maybe you'll agree, maybe you'll disagree, maybe it'll inspire you to look, for more evidence for or against what you're hearing. That's how we create critical thinkers, not by saying we can't let you hear this person because you are not safe around them. It's ridiculous.
Well, there's the complete confusion between critical thinking and criticism. And critical thinking is being conflated with criticism, which is being conflated with hate.
Exactly.
Which is wrong.
And unfortunately, it's being done far too often. And so this is why we're having these conversations. And again, if people believe in this, pony up, put a few dollars in toward James's cause, and let's make sure that we can force the institutions that are supposed to promote what you and I were just talking about, critical thinking, let's force them to have to do that, and not to be able to shut down voices they don't like to hear because they're afraid of public opinion on social media. Thank you very much, James, for speaking with me. All the links are there if anyone wants to find out more about your work, and most importantly, if anyone wants to contribute, click on the links, help support James in his fight for free speech, critical thinking, and basically helping others, because that's what you're trying to do. Any final words you'd like to share?
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak, and I thank everybody in advance who helps.
All right. Well, thank you.